Hi everyone, I'm Eve and welcome back to my channel. Today we'll be discussing Chapter 6, Less of the Mind, More of the Body, from the book History of Yoga All Started on a Stone by Ramesh Kachar. Last week we talked about Chapter 5, which covered the classical era, and if you haven't seen those discussions or any of the previous chapters, then I'll be sure to link them up here, so feel free to go watch and join the discussion. Otherwise, we'll get right into Chapter 6. Less of the Mind, More of the Body focuses on the post-classical era from 500 AD up until 1700 AD. And during this time period, there was a lot of philosophical change that had happened and a bunch of new offshoots of yoga and different versions had began to sprout up. Additionally, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism started to branch away from each other and started to form their own forms of yoga. And lastly, for many, yoga was a full-time job during this period. Ramesh overviews some of the main types of yoga that were practiced in India at this time, and they include Bhakti, Karma, Jnana, Hatha, and Tantra yoga. During this time, there were multiple gods, goddesses, deities, what have you, that were followed and worshipped. And Bhakti Yoga was used to explore love and emotional connection to these deities. What's interesting about this is that there is also the return of love and connection from the deities to the devotee. And Bhakti Yoga really focuses on this cyclical or flowing connection between the devotee and the deity, again, going back and forth. This style of yoga is still practiced to this day and tends to be a little bit more tailored to the individual. I believe Brett Larkin Yoga recently did a series on Kali, and I don't have the ability to link in my description box, so I'll try to put Brett's YouTube channel name up in case you want to check that out. I'm not sure if she would consider or they would consider it Bhakti yoga, but it seems pretty similar to the concept to me. The next style is Karma Yoga, and this focuses on attaining enlightenment through selfless action and working to create behaviors that create positive consequences. Within this style, it is made clear that these actions should happen automatically rather than having to think about what the consequences might be. Instead, it's being able to be selfless within your behaviors and your actions. And it is also noted that this skill doesn't happen overnight. It's the practice of building that skill over time so that way these actions and behaviors become automatic. Another form of yoga that happened at this time was Jnana Yoga, and this focused on attaining liberation through knowledge and wisdom. And let me just look at my notes here. This knowledge and wisdom focused on knowing the self, knowing the universe, understanding the difference between them, and also understanding the connection between them. I'm going to use my notes for this next part to make sure that I don't miss anything. And again, coming back to that knowledge piece, it was used to overcome thoughts and the ego. And this style of yoga is considered to be one of the most difficult ones to practice. Within the knowledge, there are considered 4 pillars, which include discernment, detachment, 6 virtues, and yearning. And the 6 virtues are tranquility, control, withdrawal, endurance/tolerance of suffering, faith in the yoga path, and focus. And to elaborate a little bit more on yearning, that is the yearning to be released from suffering/attain enlightenment. And this style focused a lot on self-questioning, self-reflection, and meditation. Next is Hatha Yoga, and the focus of Hatha Yoga is to move prana or life energy in the body as well as balance the self and create connection to the universe. And typically, this was done through postures and movement. However, there are a few other components that are included in Hatha Yoga. There are a lot of details that I don't want to miss in this next part, so I'm going to pull up my notes again to make sure that I get all of the details. And we'll start by talking about the different parts of Hatha Yoga. First is asana or postures. Next is pranayama, internal cleansing or shakt karma, mudras, and bandhas. So we'll go back to asana, and Ramas makes it clear that these postures are very different from the postures that we see today. At this point in time, there's only about 15, and they are mostly seated or in a laying down position. And you can find more about that in the text Hatha Yoga, Hatha Yoga Pradipika, and there are more postures that are expanded on a few centuries later in the Jaranda Samhita. Next is pranayama, which is the method used to control prana within the body and then channel it. So this is used for balancing prana within the body, and a lot of these are breath exercises, and they don't necessarily look like all of the ones that we use today. However, the Ujjayi breath and the Bhastrika breath were developed, and those are still used to this day. Next is Shat Karma, which is the internal cleansing, and there are 6 different purifications with the goal of preventing illness and old age. The first is Duati, which is the stomach, Basti, which is the colon, Neti, which is the nasal cavity, Traktaka, which is the eyes, Nauli, which is the abdominal massage via abdominal muscles, and then Kapalabhati, which is a form of pranayama, and that's used to cleanse the chakras or energy, major energy circles within the body, and this is done through forceful exhales and slow inhales. Next are mudras, and so we're moving on from the purification. We're going back to the different parts of yoga. So the mudras are energy seals, which are used to move prana, and typically these look like different hand gestures from what I am familiar with. And last is the bandhas, which are energy locks, which are used to keep prana in specific areas. And from my understanding, these are almost like holding your muscles in a certain way. And many of these practitioners who practice this practice all of these different components for several years in order to get them just right. And Ramas also notes that this was the one that is probably still most frequently used in modern times. However, it's also probably the one that has been changed and adapted the most. The last style that Ramas mentions is Tantra Yoga, and Ramas notes that this style is not necessarily tied to a specific religion or movement at the time, and it was a welcome practice to anyone and focused a lot on rituals. And it really took off in Southeast Asia and spread throughout that area and became popular. Also, there was a version that sprouted in Tibetan Buddhism. During this time period, many of the practitioners of yoga were male, and in some styles, it was looked down upon for females to practice yoga. However, there were some styles which were very welcoming to everybody, such as Bhakti Yoga, which didn't really care what gender you were, what caste you were in, etc. They wanted to welcome you to practice. And there were a few different terms used to describe people who practice yoga. So one, I believe, is still used to this day, a yogi, and usually refers to male practitioners, while the term yogini focuses on female practitioners. Additionally, some of these yogis and yoginis were considered wise men or gurus, and people sought them out in order to gain greater understanding of themselves, the universe, and the connection between the two. And oftentimes, these wise men or gurus lived in the wilderness. The last part of this chapter focuses on the decline of yoga in India, and it is believed that this decline occurred because of two major invasions, one being from the Mughals and the second being from the British Empire. The Mughals had less of an effect on the decline of yoga, depending on the ruler that was present, because some rulers actually embraced the practice and developed their own styles of yoga, while the British rule had a major impact on its decline. The first being that when the British invasion and takeover of India happened, there was a lot of poverty that was caused in the area, and so a lot of people became homeless or were without homes, and they continued to practice yoga, especially hatha yoga, on the streets. And hatha yoga can be somewhat intense, especially if you're not familiar with the practice at this time. There were certain British citizens who felt like they were witnessing black magic and different things that shouldn't be practiced. So the British rule came in and said, nope, you can't practice that anymore, and instead would encourage people to do their less intrusive practices like meditation. And that those are some of the major things that caused the decline in India with yoga. That is the end of chapter 6. A reminder that next week's reading is chapter 7, which is titled From East to West and focuses on the modern era, which is 1800 CE and onward. And next, we'll get into a few questions. My first question for you is, what style of yoga would you like to learn more about? I think for me, it's hard to choose, but I would choose Hatha Yoga since I feel like the modern version of it is so much different than how it began. And I find it's interesting to see where things started and how they evolve over time. My second question for you is, what surprised you most about this chapter? And the thing that surprised me the most is the decline of yoga in India. I didn't realize how big of an impact those invasions had on India and its culture. I knew that there was a lot of change that happened. However, I didn't know that yoga had seen a decline. I thought that it had always been strong in India and its culture. Anyway, that's it for this week. So I look forward to seeing your answers in the comments down below, and we'll see you next week. Bye.